The heat over Saigon in the summer of 1954 carried a strange tension, half hope, half foreboding. The French tricolor still fluttered over certain compounds, but its colors had already begun to fade under the monsoon sun. In the wake of the Geneva Accords, Vietnam stood cut in two, a communist North under Ho Chi Minh and a fledgling South grasping for identity. Amid this fragile moment, a quiet American stepped off a plane at Tan Son Nhut Airfield. Colonel Edward Lansdale, a man of restless energy and secret orders. Lansdale arrived under the guise of an Air Force attaché, but his true mission had little to do with airplanes. He had been sent to forge the foundations of America's invisible war in Indochina, a network of minds, loyalties, and illusions. The Saigon Military Mission, or SMM, existed on paper as a small advisory unit. In reality, it was Washington's first clandestine arm in Vietnam, the seed from which the future Saigon Station of the CIA would grow. He had come fresh from the jungles of the Philippines, where he had helped craft a counterinsurgency campaign against the Huc Rebellion. Now, Vietnam would be his next laboratory. The United States, uncertain whether the French-backed government could survive, wanted someone to wage psychological warfare, to mold public opinion, to turn a government built of paper and fear into a symbol of anti-communist endurance. Lansdale was their man, a maverick who believed hearts and minds could be bent as easily as steel, provided one understood the local rhythm. The first order of business was to find allies, or at least those who could be persuaded to act like allies. Ngo Dinh Diem, the austere nationalist who had just been appointed prime minister, was besieged by enemies on all sides. French officers who mistrusted him, Buddhist and Catholic factions competing for power, and armed sects that commanded private armies larger than his own national forces. Lansdale moved quietly between these fault lines, charming generals, priests, and journalists alike. He cultivated Diem's confidence, convinced the man that America's commitment was his lifeline, and whispered to Washington that this stubborn leader might yet be the South's salvation. What emerged was a strange and overlapping structure. Officially, there was the CIA's Saigon Station, answering through formal intelligence channels. Unofficially, Lansdale's Saigon Military Mission operated almost as a parallel government, reporting directly to Washington through back channels. The two entities shared agents, assets, and occasionally even rivals. It was a bureaucratic labyrinth, a hidden maze of overlapping missions, where one hand often moved without knowing what the other was doing. Amid this confusion, Lansdale devised a spectacle that would change the demographic and spiritual balance of the South. It would be remembered as Operation Passage to Freedom, though few in the refugee columns crossing muddy roads could imagine the scale of what they were part of. Beginning in August 1954, American and French vessels began ferrying nearly 1 million civilians from the communist North to the South. Catholic villagers, frightened by rumors of persecution, boarded ships with rosaries in hand and children on their backs. The United States Navy provided transport, while Lansdale's team orchestrated the invisible campaign of persuasion behind the migration. Leaflets dropped from the sky warned that God himself was moving southward. Posters hinted that the Virgin Mary had chosen Saigon as her refuge. Loudspeakers along the Red River Delta blared stories of divine visions and atomic bombs. It was not a war of bullets, but of words and symbols. In the alleys of Hanoi, whispers spread that those who stayed behind would be doomed. And in Saigon, the refugee ships arrived one after another, proof that the message had struck deep. For Lansdale, it was a triumph of psychological warfare. For history, it was the moment when the South's destiny was rewritten by propaganda and faith. But Saigon remained a cauldron of competing powers. Within the capital's colonial villas, generals plotted. In the countryside, sects like the Cao Dai and the Hua Hao controlled entire provinces. Each faction had its own militia, its own flag, its own dreams of sovereignty. Diem, austere but unbending, was determined to unify them under his command. Here, Lansdale's role turned from persuader to manipulator. He opened lines of communication with the leaders of these sects, sometimes promising weapons, sometimes offering protection, and sometimes simply playing them against one another. His talent lay in making every man believe he was being heard while guiding the conversation toward Washington's desired outcome. One of his earliest victories came against General Nguyen Van Hinh, the French-trained commander of the Vietnamese National Army. Hinh, a loyalist to the colonial past, had become the center of an anti-Diem faction. Instead of confrontation, Lansdale proposed subtlety. A carefully arranged temporary visit to Manila removed the general from Saigon without bloodshed. The crisis that might have destroyed Diem's government dissolved overnight. Washington noted the success and began to place greater faith in Lansdale's brand of quiet interference. While palace intrigues consumed the capital, Lansdale turned his attention to the logistical backbone of the coming struggle. Using front companies such as Civil Air Transport, an airline secretly owned by American intelligence, he created an undercurrent of supply lines stretching from the northern ports to the southern airfields. Before the French even completed their withdrawal, warehouses in Haiphong held caches of material destined for covert operations in the south. It was an invisible infrastructure, built not for the present but for the wars yet to come. By early 1955, the SMM's influence reached far beyond Saigon. Teams of advisors and propagandists fanned out into the provinces, distributing pamphlets, organizing village self-defense groups, and gathering intelligence on suspected communist sympathizers. In the Delta towns, banners proclaiming loyalty to Diem appeared overnight. In the countryside, school teachers trained under SMM programs began teaching lessons about freedom, democracy, and the threat of red slavery. It was an embryonic version of what later generations would call nation building, though at the time it looked more like improvisation under fire. The American officers working under Lansdale often found themselves drawn into scenes that felt more theater than politics. They attended seances with religious leaders, shared tea with warlords, and wrote anonymous editorials for Vietnamese newspapers. The line between diplomacy and deception blurred until neither could be clearly defined. What mattered was the outcome: a government that survived long enough for the United States to claim a foothold in Southeast Asia. By 1956, Diem had consolidated power, the sect armies were subdued, and the French presence had dwindled to insignificance. On paper, South Vietnam appeared stable. Beneath the surface, however, the country was now bound to a network of American influence so dense it could no longer breathe on its own. The Saigon military mission had done its work too well. Its methods, psychological warfare, covert funding, manipulation of local politics, would become the blueprint for later American involvement. The labyrinth was complete, but the exit was nowhere in sight. Lansdale, with his affable smile and restless energy, left behind a city changed. The streets of Saigon buzzed with new slogans, new loyalties, and the faint hum of unseen machinery. The refugees from the north had been resettled, their faith turned into a political weapon. The armed sects had been folded into the National Army or broken apart, yet peace did not follow. Instead, the quiet hum of intelligence operations deepened, and a new kind of war, one fought through whispers, pamphlets, and coded telegrams, took hold of the city. In these early years, the story of Saigon Station was not written in battles, but in choices. The choice to replace colonial power with covert power. The choice to win hearts by manipulating fears. The choice to build a state upon secrets. Every file, every operation, every handshake in those smoky rooms of 1954 to 1956 became part of the scaffolding that would support the long, painful war to come. The men who walked those corridors could not have known how deep the maze would go, or how many would be lost within it. But they were the first to step inside, and the door closed softly behind them. By the year 1956, the thunder of the refugee ships had faded, and Saigon entered a new phase, quieter on the surface, more dangerous underneath. The Ngo family had become the center of power, but also its own shadow. President Ngo Dinh Diem, his brother and strategist Ngo Dinh Nhu, and Ngu's wife, the fiery Madame Nhu, ruled over the South like a family monarchy draped in Republican silk. Behind their polished speeches and religious devotion, a different machine was grinding into motion, one built on surveillance, censorship, and fear. At the heart of this machine stood a man few outside Vietnam had ever heard of, Dr. Trun Kim Thuy. A physician by training, a propagandist by instinct, Thuy became Dim's secret architect of internal security and his family's link to the world of shadows. He was both loyal servant and manipulative strategist, the indispensable bridge between the CIA and the Ngo household. In him, the invisible hand of American intelligence found a local pulse. Under Thuyn's direction, the Special Police, a hybrid of Secret Service and political enforcer, expanded into a nationwide web of watchers and whisperers. Files were opened on monks, officers, teachers, even on Diem's own ministers. The capital hummed with suspicion. Cafes were no longer safe for casual talk. The man pouring your tea might be an informant. To the Americans, Thuyn was both valuable and unnerving. He could get things done, arrests, infiltrations, the quelling of dissent, but his loyalty was to the Ngo family first and to no foreign power second. With CIA assistance, Thuyn created CPS, the Service of Political and Social Studies, a benign title masking a covert intelligence directorate that reported directly to Ngo Dinh Nhu. CPS recruited agents from universities, seminaries, and refugee camps, training them for espionage and propaganda. Many were sent north on sabotage missions, to gather information, to spread rumors, to poison wells of morale. Few returned. The casualty rate was staggering, and yet the missions continued, driven by an obsession that someday, through psychological operations, the North might fracture from within. Lansdale had left Vietnam by then, and the style of operations changed. Where Lansdale had favored persuasion and human contact, Nhu and Thuyn preferred control and ideology. They built their internal order on a philosophy Nhu called personalism, a blend of Catholic moralism and anti-communist idealism. In theory, it placed the dignity of the individual at the center of governance. In practice, it sanctified obedience to the family and its leader. Schools taught it. Officials swore by it. Newspapers repeated its phrases like scripture. And beneath that ideal, the Special Police watched, measured, and punished. Saigon, once alive with open debate and foreign intrigue, began to tighten. Political parties were dissolved or absorbed into the regime's revolutionary personalist Workers' Party. Radio broadcasts were censored. Editors received phone calls before printing. In the labyrinth of ministries, Nhu reigned as an unacknowledged prime minister, his word carried by a network of aides and agents loyal only to him. Even the Americans who had helped build the state now found themselves kept at arm's length. The CIA watched this evolution with unease. Reports flowing back to Langley spoke of family rule, of an intelligence apparatus consuming its own. Yet within those same cables lay grudging admiration. The streets of Saigon were safer. The communists were quieter. The insurgent networks seemed fractured. The short-term stability was undeniable. For Washington, obsessed with the domino theory, stability, any stability, was worth the moral discomfort. Thus, the CIA maintained its channel through Thuyn, funding projects, sharing reports, and tolerating the darker corners of his operations. In the countryside, however, new threats began to flicker like sparks beneath dry grass. Small bands of guerrillas reemerged in the Mekong Delta, former Viet Minh who refused to surrender or who returned from the north under new orders. They carried leaflets more often than rifles, but their presence unsettled Diem's narrative of total control. Intelligence briefings warned of infiltration routes snaking down through Laos and across the Cambodian frontier, a porous strip of jungle and riverbanks where border posts were more symbolic than real. The reports described Cambodia as a soft buffer, a region where supplies, messengers, and political agents could pass undetected. For Thuyn, these warnings became justification to expand surveillance deeper into rural zones. Special police detachments appeared in provinces once considered quiet. Interrogation centers were established, disguised as administrative offices. The same bureaucratic thoroughness that mapped Saigon's political circles was now turned on farmers and village chiefs. Files grew thicker, fear grew faster. Parallel to these security operations, American advisors introduced a new idea that would become central to later counterinsurgency doctrine: the fortified hamlet. Born from the notion that security began with community, the agrovilles were meant to group villagers into defended clusters, isolating them from guerrilla influence. The plan was ambitious but naive. Forced relocations disrupted local economies, and resentment smoldered beneath the banners of self-defense. Still, these early experiments, the Self-Defense Corps, the Civic Guard, and later the civilian irregular defense groups, formed the backbone for future operations aimed at rooting out the communist underground. By 1958, the illusion of calm began to fracture. Reports of ambushes, assassinations, and attacks on remote posts reached Saigon weekly. The countryside was slipping through the government's fingers, even as the capital gleamed with new boulevards and parades. Diem refused to believe the threat was growing. To him, unrest was proof of subversion, not popular anger. New, ever the ideologue, saw conspiracy in every protest. Tuin, trapped between loyalty and foresight, tightened the screws further. Arrests rose. Torture became a whisper on every street. In Washington, analysts noted the contradictions. The CIA's own field reports described a regime losing legitimacy among peasants even as it strengthened its secret police. Yet policy demanded optimism. The US could not abandon Diem without admitting its own experiment had failed. So the facade was maintained. Glowing briefings, hopeful statistics, assurances that insurgency was dying out. In truth, it was only changing form. Within the Ngo family, power and paranoia intertwined. Madame Nhu dominated the social scene, her sharp tongue feared even by generals. Nhu himself held salons in the family residence where intellectuals debated metaphysics, while secret agents waited outside the door. Diem prayed nightly, convinced of divine protection. And in the dark offices of the special police, Tuin compiled lists of enemies, of suspected infiltrators, of potential traitors. The invisible hand of American intelligence, which had once guided and advised, now hovered uncertainly above this web. Saigon Station officers debated whether to confront the regime's excesses or to continue the alliance. Most chose the latter. They reasoned that Diem's flaws could be corrected, that his family's rigidity was preferable to the chaos of a coup. The decision would haunt them later, but in the late 1950s, expedience outweighed principle. By 1960, the storm that had been gathering finally broke. In the highlands, insurgent units calling themselves the National Liberation Front began coordinated attacks. The Viet Cong, as the Americans would soon name them, were no longer scattered remnants, but an organized movement. The very networks that Tuin's agents had failed to penetrate now spread through the villages like veins. The fortified hamlets, once symbols of control, became targets. The family dynasty had built a cage of loyalty and fear, but the bars were bending. And so, as the decade turned, Saigon stood poised at the edge of an abyss. The invisible hand that had shaped the South, CIA funds, Diem's will, Nhu's ideology, Tuin's secret police, had created a fragile illusion of order. Beneath it, the earth trembled. The watchers had watched too closely, the rulers had ruled too tightly, and the people, caught between fear and hunger, began to listen once more to the whispers from the jungle. The maze that Lansdale had begun now had new architects. Its corridors no longer echoed with hope, but with footsteps of suspicion. In those years between 1956 and 1960, South Vietnam learned that control could masquerade as stability, and that the more a regime tries to grip its people, the faster they slip through its fingers. By the spring of 1963, the streets of Saigon no longer sang hymns of devotion. They echoed instead with chants of protest and the murmur of fear. The Ngo dynasty, once wrapped in the aura of divine mission, was unraveling beneath the weight of its own faith and repression. Buddhist monks marched with banners demanding equality. The regime responded with tear gas and bullets. The smell of incense mingled with smoke. A single act, the shooting of protesters in Hue, had ignited a moral inferno that no propaganda could extinguish. The crisis of 1963 was not born overnight. It had ripened over years of control, arrogance, and isolation. Yet when it came, it moved with the suddenness of a monsoon squall. In the alleys of Saigon, whispers turned into rumors. In the corridors of embassies, rumors hardened into plans. And in the middle of that storm stood a man named Lucien Conein, the bridge between the US Embassy, the CIA station, and a circle of restless South Vietnamese generals who had grown weary of the Ngo family's suffocating grip. Conein was a relic of older wars, a French-born American with a soldier's swagger and a spy's instincts. He had fought with the French resistance, parachuted into Indochina during World War II, and knew the country's rhythms like few others. By 1963, he was serving as a CIA operative attached to the American mission in Saigon. He was the man both sides trusted just enough to talk to, but not enough to fully believe. Through him ran the invisible wires of conspiracy. He met the generals discreetly, men like Trun Van Doan, Dung Van Min, and Ton Thut Ding, each of whom played a double game of loyalty and ambition. The meetings were held in quiet villas, sometimes at dawn, sometimes under the cover of social gatherings. Konein carried coded messages, arranged funds, and acted as intermediary between the American ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge and the plotting officers. He was both messenger and midwife to the coup that would end the Ngo dynasty. In late August, a cable from Washington reached Saigon. It was ambiguous, perhaps deliberately so. It hinted that if the generals acted against President Diem, the United States would not oppose them. Within the embassy, the message was interpreted as a green light. Within the CIA station, it was seen as recklessly premature. But once the signal was out, it could not be recalled. The coup's machinery began to move on its own momentum, like a boulder rolling down a hill. From Washington's side, the situation seemed clear in theory, but opaque in practice. The Frus cables, later declassified in full, revealed the confusion. Reports from Saigon suggested that the generals were only exploring possibilities, not ready to act. Yet subsequent telegrams, relayed through Konein, gave the impression that an operation was imminent. Each transmission crossed the Pacific slower than the events it described. The tempo of politics outpaced the rhythm of diplomacy. Ambassador Lodge, confident in his authority, grew impatient with the caution of his intelligence officers. CIA Director John McCone and Far East Division Chief William Colby, thousands of miles away, fumed over his independent maneuvering. They warned that the situation was unstable, that meddling in palace politics could open a vacuum the communists would soon fill. But by then, the die was cast. Lodge dismissed his own station chief, John Richardson, a man too close to the Ngo family, too hesitant to play the role of conspirator. In that single decision, the lines of responsibility blurred beyond repair. Konein, meanwhile, became the indispensable conduit. He passed money to the generals for logistical purposes, relayed assurances of American neutrality, and set the timetable for contact once the operation began. The arrangement was brutally simple. The Americans would not intervene. The coup leaders would guarantee the safety of Diem and his brother Nhu. Both sides lied to themselves about how this would end. As autumn approached, Saigon's atmosphere thickened. Soldiers whispered in barracks. Civilians stocked rice in fear of curfews. On the night of October 31st, Konein met the conspirators for the last time before the strike. He handed them a final payment, small bills wrapped in brown paper, and a coded message confirming that Washington understood the gravity of their decision. He later recalled that the generals looked calm, almost detached, as if history were merely another order to be carried out. The coup began in the early hours of November 1st. Tanks rolled down Gia Long Street. Radio stations went silent. The sound of artillery fire echoed from the direction of the presidential palace. American advisors were told to remain indoors. Konein waited near the Joint General Staff compound, his radio tuned to fragmented transmissions in Vietnamese and English. Through the crackling static, one phrase repeated, "The family has been captured." By nightfall, it was over. Diem and Nhu fled through a network of tunnels, seeking refuge in a church in Cholon. They prayed briefly, then surrendered to a convoy sent by the generals. The brothers were placed in an armored personnel carrier. Minutes later, gunfire erupted inside. Whether by accident or design, they were dead before reaching headquarters. The news spread through Saigon like a shockwave. In the marketplaces around Ben Thanh, people emerged cautiously from hiding. Some cheered, others wept. The loudspeakers that once blared government decrees now broadcast martial music. At the U.S. compound, officers watched from balconies, uncertain whether to celebrate or mourn. The operation had succeeded, but in its success, it had opened a void. Inside Saigon Station, the aftermath was chaos. Files were destroyed, contacts vanished, and networks carefully built over a decade collapsed overnight. The very stability the CIA had helped create through Diem's regime had evaporated in a single day. The city's police, its military, its ministries, all were now pawns in a scramble for authority. Generals who had marched together turned against one another before the ink on their proclamations had dried. Washington's initial euphoria faded within days. The cables that followed read like laments. "We have unseated a tyrant," one analyst wrote, "but we have also unseated the only order we had." The intelligence community's private assessments were even harsher. They admitted that the coup had not been coordinated by any coherent political force. It was, in effect, a decapitation without a successor. Conan, for his part, received the CIA's thanks and a quiet reprimand. He had done his job too well. His contacts were now the ruling junta, but his name was poison to them. Evidence of foreign interference. He remained in Saigon for a time, watching the empire of the Ngos dissolve into factionalism. Years later, he would say that he never truly knew who gave the final order to kill the brothers. Perhaps no one did. In the weeks following November 1st, Saigon trembled between jubilation and uncertainty. The flags changed, but the shadows remained. The special police fractured, their loyalty uncertain. New's personal intelligence empire disintegrated, scattering agents into rival camps. The Americans tried to rebuild lines of communication, but the structure of control had vanished. The CIA, once operating through the clear hierarchy of the Ngo regime, now faced a mosaic of generals, each seeking advantage, each demanding recognition. The coup had removed the family, but it had not removed the forces that birthed it: ambition, fear, ideology, and the illusion of control. In destroying their creation, the Americans had also destroyed their most predictable ally. South Vietnam, unmoored from its central authority, would drift toward an even deeper entanglement of coups, counter-coups, and insurgency. For the people of Saigon, life went on in the uneasy calm of aftermath. The smell of burned fuel lingered in the air. Soldiers lounged at street corners, rifles resting on their knees. In temples, monks prayed for the dead. In foreign compounds, typewriters clattered out new reports for Washington. Yet beneath every sentence lay the same haunting truth. The storm had passed, but the foundations had cracked. The events of 1963 marked the end of an era, the fall of a dynasty born in faith and ended in betrayal. It was a lesson written not in ideology, but in the fragile arithmetic of power, that alliances built on secrecy could dissolve in a moment, and that even the invisible hand guiding them might lose its grip when the winds of crisis rose. After the fall of the Ngo dynasty, South Vietnam staggered through chaos. Cabinets rose and fell like waves breaking against a rotting pier. Generals plotted, provinces rebelled, and villages burned without knowing who ruled them. Amid this confusion, a new kind of war took root, a war not of open battlefields, but of shadows, dossiers, and whispered names. The communists had begun to weave their political infrastructure deep into the countryside, threading invisible veins of control through hamlets, pagodas, and family networks. The Americans, unable to see this enemy clearly, decided to create one of their own, an invisible army to fight the unseen. The architect of that army was Pierre de Silva, a quiet, sharp-minded CIA officer who took charge of Saigon Station in 1964. He understood that the traditional war, the one measured in captured territory and body counts, was already lost in the Delta mud. The true battlefield lay in the hearts and habits of the villagers, where the Viet Cong built their shadow government. To fight them, De Silva proposed something radical: small, ruthless teams designed not to defend but to hunt. He called them counter-terror teams. The name itself was both literal and deliberate. These teams were meant to strike terror into those who spread it, recruited from the most loyal elements of the South Vietnamese security forces. Often defectors, local toughs, or men with grudges, they operated outside the formal chain of command. They dressed like peasants, spoke in whispers, and disappeared before dawn. Their task was to identify and eliminate the VCI, the Viet Cong infrastructure, the network of political cadres, tax collectors, couriers, and propagandists who sustained the insurgency from within. At first, the program was small and experimental. Teams of 10 or 12 men moved through villages by night, guided by informants or intelligence gathered from interrogations. They struck quickly, sometimes too quickly. Stories spread of villages awakened by explosions, of suspects taken away and never seen again. The word terror clung to the teams like smoke. American officers began to flinch at the name. So, in bureaucratic fashion, the program was renamed Provincial Reconnaissance Units, or PRU. The work remained the same, only the title changed. The PRU soon became a sprawling network. Each province controlled its own team, but the lines of authority were tangled. Officially, the units fell under the supervision of the provincial chief. Unofficially, they answered to the CIA advisors who paid, trained, and armed them. It was a dual system, one civilian, one clandestine, and it thrived in the gray zone between. The Americans provided modern radios, small arms, and intelligence from aerial reconnaissance. The Vietnamese provided local knowledge, grudges, and names. Together, they formed a hybrid force, part police, part assassin, part phantom. Recruitment was selective and cynical. Many PRU members were former guerrillas turned by promise of money or revenge. Others came from rural militias, hardened men who knew every footpath and hiding place. Training emphasized infiltration, disguise, and the art of the ambush. A PRU team would slip into a hamlet dressed as farmers, eat with villagers, and vanish before nightfall to strike the next hamlet over. Their operations blurred the line between policing and retribution. Success was measured not in trials or confessions, but in the number of neutralized cadres, those killed, captured, or persuaded to defect. In Saigon, the intelligence bureaucracy strained to control the chaos it had unleashed. To coordinate the many arms of this secret war, the CIA established DIOCCs, District Intelligence and Operations Coordination Centers. Each center fused together 3 distinct agencies: the Census Grievance Program, which gathered information from villagers under the pretense of social surveys; the Special Branch, responsible for political policing and interrogations; and the PRU teams, who carried out the final act. At the DICC, maps, photographs, and confession sheets converged on one table. It was here that decisions were made about who would live and who would vanish. The language of the reports was clinical. Targets were extracted, relocated, or neutralized. Behind each word, a family disappeared, a hamlet fell silent. But in the cold calculus of counterinsurgency, the system worked. By mid-1966, the PRU had dismantled several district-level Viet Cong committees and captured valuable documents revealing enemy infiltration routes. The generals praised the results. Washington approved more funding. American Marines, newly deployed in force, began to interface with the PRU in the coastal provinces and the Mekong Delta. What had begun as a small intelligence experiment now merged with the operational rhythm of the war. U.S. Marine advisors learned to move with the PRU, to read the land not as topography, but as rumor, who owed taxes to the Viet Cong, who buried rice for them, who spoke too cautiously at night. The Marines brought discipline and logistics. The PRU brought local cunning. Together they waged what some called the Silent War, a campaign fought in whispers, arrests, and midnight raids. For the Marines, accustomed to open combat, this was a new kind of struggle. Victories were invisible. Failure could not be proven. They wrote home about the strangeness of it. No front lines, no uniforms, only suspicion and the constant awareness that a friend might be an informer. Yet, this collaboration honed a dark efficiency. Intelligence gathered by Marines in one hamlet could be passed through the DOC system and lead to a PRU strike miles away within days. The moral boundaries blurred further as success bred demand. Provincial chiefs, eager to impress their superiors, inflated reports. CIA officers, pressured for results, sometimes accepted questionable intelligence. Villagers began to fear the PRU as much as the Viet Cong. The war had turned in upon itself, a mirror war where both sides hunted ghosts and justified the means by the urgency of survival. By the end of 1967, the machinery of intelligence had grown so large it required its own command structure. Washington decided to merge the civilian pacification programs with military operations under a new umbrella called CORDS, Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support. It was the first true civil-military hybrid command in the Vietnam conflict. Under CORDS, CIA officers worked alongside U.S. Army generals, and provincial chiefs shared offices with civilian advisors. The old boundary between spy and soldier dissolved entirely. The creation of CORDS marked the transition from experiment to institution. The techniques born in secrecy under De Silva were now official policy. Files thickened, metrics multiplied, and what had begun as counterterror evolved into the grand design that would soon be called Phoenix. In bureaucratic terms, it was a program to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure. In human terms, it was the codification of the hunt, a system where suspicion became evidence, and evidence often ended in death. By this time, the American public still believed the war was one of jungles and firefights, of soldiers advancing under fire. Few imagined the parallel conflict waged in candlelit offices, where Vietnamese clerks compiled lists from rumors and confessions, and where men with clipboards decided who would vanish before sunrise. The war had split into two realities: the visible and the invisible. Pierre de Silva left Vietnam in 1965, but his blueprint endured. The PRU remained the most effective and most feared instrument of the Saigon government. Every hamlet that burned, every cadre that disappeared, every name crossed off a list was another stroke in his design. Those who replaced him refined it further, tightening the coordination between intelligence and violence until the two were indistinguishable. In the villages, peasants learned to live with the dual terror. By day, the Viet Cong came to collect rice and allegiance. By night, the PRU returned to demand the same. To survive, many gave to both and trusted neither. Fear became the currency of loyalty. When the year turned to 1968 and the Tet Offensive exploded across the South, this architecture of surveillance and retribution would become the backbone of America's response. But for now, in the waning light of 1967, the system stood complete. A pyramid of information rising from the rice fields to the embassy roof, sustained by secrecy and sealed with silence. The war had changed shape. It was no longer about territory or ideology. It was about control of the invisible, the contest to know more, to strike first, to erase the enemy before the enemy even had a name. And within that quiet, efficient cruelty, the next chapter of the conflict was already waiting to be written. By the dawn of 1968, South Vietnam was no longer a battleground of fronts and banners. It had become a theater of statistics. After the shock of the Tet Offensive, when the Viet Cong struck in every province and even breached the gates of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, Washington demanded proof that progress was possible. The answer came not in captured territory or pacified villages, but in numbers, cold, clinical, and strangely comforting to those far from the war. The Phoenix program, born from the merger of Cord's bureaucracy and the CIA's clandestine design, now stood at the center of America's strategy. Its purpose was deceptively simple: to dismantle the Viet Cong infrastructure, the political skeleton beneath the guerrilla flesh. To do so, it turned the entire machinery of the South Vietnamese state into an apparatus of identification, interrogation, and elimination. Files replaced maps. Names replaced coordinates. The war was now fought in ledgers. The reports that flowed from Saigon glowed with precision. By 1971, Phoenix claimed to have neutralized 81,740 members of the Viet Cong infrastructure. Of these, 26,369 were killed. The rest were captured or defected. The numbers gleamed like medals in briefings and congressional hearings. Charts rose and dipped like heartbeats, each line a measure of supposed victory. Yet beneath those neat figures lay a swamp of ambiguity. The majority of the dead, 87%, according to internal assessments, fell not to Phoenix's surgical strikes, but to conventional military operations: air raids, artillery sweeps, ambushes with no names attached. Only 13% were directly killed through Phoenix or its provincial reconnaissance units. Still, the totals were presented as proof that the infrastructure was collapsing. Washington wanted success. Saigon wanted funding. The numbers obliged both. Inside Vietnam, the reality was harsher. The regional interrogation centers, sanitized in reports as PX, provincial interrogation centers, became grim symbols of the program's moral corrosion. Built with American funds, they were staffed by Vietnamese officers and monitored loosely by CIA advisors. Prisoners were brought in after midnight, blindfolded and beaten into submission. In theory, the purpose was to extract intelligence about the enemy's hierarchy. In practice, it became a brutal lottery of confessions, names given under duress, recycled into new arrests, feeding the machine of statistics. For many in the field, it was simply how the war worked. The quotas demanded results, and results meant bodies. Young Vietnamese officers, eager for promotion, learned to interpret neutralization as an order to eliminate, not to reform. Each success report fed the illusion of control. Each interrogation built the myth that information could conquer ideology. And as the paperwork multiplied, so did the ghosts of the disappeared. In April of 1969, Saigon Station sent a confidential assessment to Langley. The tone was unusually somber. The document noted that the Viet Cong had begun to counterstrike, not with bombs, but with assassinations, targeting the very officials who ran the Phoenix program, the pacification chiefs, the village administrators, and the informants who formed its veins. The communists, it said, had learned the language of their enemy. If Phoenix hunted the infrastructure, they would hunt the hunters. That year became a duel of invisibility. Across the Mekong Delta, leaflets appeared overnight, naming local officials marked for death. Many of those names matched Phoenix officers or collaborators. In Quang Ngai province alone, over 100 government workers were killed in the last 6 months of the year. It was as if the mirror had cracked and each side was staring at its reflection, an underground war of vengeance disguised as strategy. By December of that same year, another CIA memorandum attempted to redefine the narrative. It insisted that Phoenix's purpose was not body counts, but the destruction of the communist political structure, the committees, cells, and informant rings that guided guerrilla warfare. The objective, the memo stated, was to sever the arteries through which the insurgency breathes. Yet even as it was written, the field reports contradicted it. The metrics of success remained numerical: kills, captures, defectors. Philosophy had surrendered to arithmetic. The contradiction seeped into the hearts of those who worked within the program. Some American advisors, hardened by years in the field, defended Phoenix as the only means of survival. They argued that the Viet Cong used the same methods, that morality had no place in a war where every civilian could be a courier. Others, State Department officials, journalists, and even soldiers, called it by its true name, a campaign of organized terror. The truth lay somewhere between, an imperfect machine fueled by fear, necessity, and the desperate belief that order could be imposed through precision. Cords, now the bureaucratic empire overseeing the pacification effort, found itself trapped between policy and reality. Reports boasted of pacified hamlets and secure provinces, yet intelligence from the countryside told another story. Villages rebuilt during the day under government supervision were quietly supplying rice and recruits to the Viet Cong by night. The infrastructure had adapted, shedding its exposed layers and burrowing deeper into families, temples, and trade networks. Still, Phoenix achieved something undeniable. It forced the enemy to evolve. By 1969, communist directives acknowledged that their local committees were being decimated and ordered them to change tactics. No longer could they rely on public meetings or visible tax collection. Instead, they adopted compartmentalized cells, stricter secrecy, and increased emphasis on infiltration within government institutions. The very ferocity of Phoenix had reshaped the enemy into something even harder to see. To the men at Saigon Station, this was vindication, a sign that their methods, however brutal, were effective. But in the villages, the legacy was darker. Families lived between two terrors: the nightly knock of the PRU and the sudden arrival of Viet Cong justice squads. The lines blurred until no one could tell who fought for what. Parents told children to forget names, to speak only when spoken to. Survival itself became the only ideology. By the early 70s, the Phoenix program had entered its own twilight. Political pressure in the United States grew as journalists uncovered the darker corners of the campaign. Congressional hearings called it a program of assassination. Officials in Saigon, eager to avoid scandal, began to rebrand it once again, folding its remnants into broader security operations. But for those who had lived through it, the name Phoenix would never fade. It had become a symbol of power wielded without mercy, of intelligence turned into instrument, of a war that had lost its moral compass in pursuit of victory by numbers. When Cords released its internal summary in the final months of 1971, the language was cautious. It called the program's results ambiguous. The insurgency had been weakened, yes, but not broken. The infrastructure had been fragmented, yet not destroyed. Still, it concluded that Phoenix had forced the enemy to shift resources, turning their focus from rural expansion to survival. A strategic victory measured in delay, not defeat. To the generals and politicians, that was enough. To the villages that had bled for it, it was meaningless. The program that once promised to bring clarity to the murk of insurgency had instead become the murk itself. In the end, Phoenix rose and fell like its mythic namesake. From the ashes of chaos, it had been born. In the flames of controversy, it would die. But the architecture it built, the networks of informants, the logic of neutralization, the idea that control could be quantified, would outlive it, lingering in the algorithms and doctrines of wars yet to come. Between 1968 and 1971, the war in Vietnam ceased to be about victory in the traditional sense. It became a contest of survival between two invisible empires, one of ideology, the other of intelligence. And in that contest, both sides lost pieces of their soul. By the mid-1960s, the secret war that had once promised precision and control had begun to fracture under its own ambitions. While Saigon's alleys echoed with whispers of phoenix and counter-terror, another shadow war unfolded far to the north, an audacious attempt to pierce the heart of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam itself. It was a campaign conceived in confidence, executed in silence, and remembered mostly for its ghosts. The plan was simple on paper: infiltrate small teams of South Vietnamese commandos into the north, gather intelligence, sabotage transport routes, and spark the kind of internal unrest that propaganda alone could not. It was called Project Tiger, and it carried the signature optimism of early Cold War covert thinking, the belief that a handful of well-trained men could topple an ideology. Between 1961 and 1963, dozens of teams parachuted into the misty mountains and jungles of the north. They carried radios, explosives, and hope. Some landed far from their targets, others vanished without a signal. The communiques that did return, brief, coded bursts from the darkness, were often fabrications. Hanoi's counterintelligence service, having captured the first infiltrators, cleverly turned them into double agents. For years, they sent back false reports, feeding Washington an illusion of success while leading more teams into ambushes. By the time the truth emerged, nearly every agent dispatched northward had been captured or killed. The networks built with such secrecy had become traps, their coordinates memorized by the enemy. What the Americans had imagined as a hidden front became a showcase of futility. It was the first great humiliation of the clandestine war, and it taught both Saigon and Langley a bitter lesson. The North was not a blank map to be written on. It was a fortress of loyalty and surveillance, sealed from within. The failure went deeper than tactics. It exposed a fracture in partnership between American planners and their South Vietnamese counterparts. Many of the agents deployed under Project Tiger came from the CPS network, the Service for Political and Social Studies, that had once been Ngo Dinh Nhuy's private intelligence arm. After Diem's fall, these men found themselves adrift, their loyalties fragmented. Some volunteered for northern missions out of conviction. Others saw it as the only way to remain relevant in the new military regime. Few realized that they were walking into a one-way corridor. The casualty rate was staggering. Of the dozens of infiltration teams launched, fewer than a handful ever returned. The rest were declared missing, a euphemism that hid the horror of capture, torture, and execution. In Saigon's intelligence circles, whispers spread of betrayal and double-crossing. The lessons were grim. Never trust a single radio source, never reuse a landing zone, never assume silence means success. The art of clandestine warfare, once draped in romantic notions of heroism, became an exercise in suspicion and despair. As Project Tiger disintegrated, the Pentagon's growing influence in Vietnam reshaped the covert landscape. What had been a CIA domain now passed into military hands. By 1964, the newly formed Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, or MACVSOG, took charge of operations across the borders and behind enemy lines. It was a joint command of soldiers, spies, and dreamers, a hybrid of military discipline and clandestine audacity. Its mission: conduct reconnaissance, sabotage, and psychological warfare across the entire Indochinese theater. SOG inherited both the ambitions and the ghosts of Project Tiger. Many of its first missions reused the same infiltration routes, down the Laos corridor, across Cambodia's jungles, or through the mountains bordering China's Guangxi Autonomous Region. The idea was to intercept the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline of supplies running from north to south. Yet every success seemed to carry the seed of its own failure. The trail multiplied, split, and shifted like a living organism, fed by the terrain and shielded by the population. What could be bombed one week was rebuilt the next. CIA reports from the period read like dispatches from a labyrinth. They spoke of material diversion, of weapons and equipment sent for friendly operations that somehow reappeared in enemy hands. Supplies shipped from American bases leaked through black markets in Laos and Cambodia, blurring the line between corruption and infiltration. Every route designed to deliver advantage also delivered uncertainty. In the fog of proxy logistics, even the most loyal ally could become a suspect. In Washington, the failures forced reflection. The North Vietnamese had proven almost impenetrable to infiltration. Their counterintelligence network, disciplined and patient, turned every captured agent into a potential weapon. It was said that Hanoi played chess while Washington played poker, one side counting moves, the other counting risks. After Project Tiger, the CIA's enthusiasm for deep penetration waned. The agency withdrew from direct northern operations, leaving SOG and the military to bear the burden of cross-border war. Attention shifted southward, back to the familiar terrain of villages, markets, and urban backstreets. The logic was pragmatic. If the North could not be reached from above, the South had to be secured from within. The hunt for the VCI, the infrastructure of the Viet Cong, became the focus once more. Phoenix and its satellites absorbed manpower and funding. Covert resources that might once have supported sabotage missions were redirected into surveillance, counter-assassination, and internal policing. Saigon, meanwhile, became a chessboard of intrigue. After the Tet Offensive of 1968, the city's confidence had been shattered. Explosions in cafes, ambushes on military convoys, assassinations in daylight. Each act chipped away at the illusion of control. The PRU units, veterans of rural counter-terror operations, were repurposed for urban work. In District 1 and the Kolon sector, networks of informants sprang up like spiderwebs. Barbers, rickshaw drivers, and hotel clerks fed intelligence to handlers who filed reports that ended in midnight raids. The urban intelligence war was less dramatic than the failed infiltrations up north, but far more pervasive. It was fought in whispers and glances, in the coded language of police records and coffeehouse gossip. Saigon's residents learned to recognize the unmarked jeeps that cruised slowly at dusk and the plainclothes men who always walked in pairs. Fear settled into the rhythm of daily life. To many Americans stationed there, it was a paradox. The CIA had once tried to penetrate the enemy's territory. Now it struggled to defend its own backyard. The battlefield had inverted. Counter-infiltration became survival, and the enemy's agents seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere. In reports to Washington, analysts wrote of increased urban threat indicators. But behind those sterile phrases lay the image of a city divided against itself. A city where loyalty could change with the price of a bribe or the promise of protection. The failures of Project Tiger and the limits of SOG were not merely operational, they were philosophical. They revealed the illusion that technology and training could overcome culture and conviction. They showed that a war of secrecy, no matter how well financed, could not survive without trust. And trust was the one commodity Vietnam had run out of. By 1970, SOG's missions continued, expanding into Laos and Cambodia with daring and desperation. But the pattern persisted. High risk, limited success, heavy loss. The deeper the Americans pushed into the jungles, the clearer it became that the enemy's strength was not in the terrain, but in the will of its people and the discipline of its counterintelligence. In Saigon's underground bars, where soldiers and spies drank away their sleepless nights, old hands would mutter about the commandos who never came back. They walked into the north and vanished, they said, as if speaking of ghosts. Some believed they were still alive, hidden in prison camps. Others insisted they had been turned, feeding false hope into American radios. No one truly knew. What was certain was that the dreams of the early 60s, the belief that small, left secret wars could change the course of nations, had died somewhere in those mountains. By the early 70s, the United States had grown cautious. Covert action had become a dirty phrase, and the price of failure too visible to ignore. The CIA scaled back its field operations, while the military focused on Vietnamization, transferring responsibility to the South. Yet the legacy of those lost missions lingered. It haunted every policy discussion, every new proposal for limited intervention. The ghosts of Project Tiger and the men of SOG whispered a warning that the deeper one ventures into another nation's shadows, the easier it is to lose sight of the light. In the end, the secret war against the North had achieved little more than lessons written in blood. It had exposed the futility of arrogance, the limits of clandestine power, and the tragic symmetry of two nations locked in mutual deceit. As the helicopters lifted off from hidden bases and the last Saji teams melted back into the jungle, the silence that followed felt heavier than any defeat. The war would continue, but the dream of mastering it from the shadows was over. Among the crowd of foreign correspondents who filled the cafes and press rooms of Saigon in the late 1960s, one man blended so perfectly into the background that few ever looked twice. He was polite, quiet, and quick with a cigarette. He moved easily among soldiers, diplomats, and journalists, speaking fluent English with a soft Vietnamese accent. His name was Phạm Xuân Ẩn, and his business card identified him as a correspondent for Time magazine. To the Americans, he was a trusted friend and an invaluable guide through the labyrinth of Vietnamese politics. To the South Vietnamese, he was an urbane intellectual with enviable Western connections. And to the North, whose name he never spoke aloud, he was one of their greatest spies. For over a decade, An lived a life of extraordinary duality. By day, he worked from the Time Bureau, gathering quotes, writing dispatches, and assisting American journalists in deciphering the chaos of the war. By night, he became a conduit of intelligence, an unseen courier of secrets that could shape entire campaigns. He was the perfect observer, and his disguise was flawless precisely because it was real. He was a journalist with a keen mind, a wry sense of humor, and genuine curiosity about the war around him. The deception lay not in what he did, but in who benefited from what he knew. The war had created many spies, but few as complete as Phạm Xuân Ẩn. Born near Saigon, educated under the French, and later sent by American sponsors to study journalism in California, he understood both the West's ideals and its blind spots. He returned home in the early 1950s, a man who could move comfortably between cultures. His Western education gave him credibility among Americans. His patriotism bound him to the communist cause. Between those two loyalties, he carved out a space where he could operate invisibly, inside the beating heart of Saigon's intelligence world. From his desk at Time, Ian had access to an endless stream of information. Reporters came and went, sharing gossip, leaks, and classified tidbits they had gleaned from military briefings. U.S. officers, eager for publicity, confided in him as if he were one of their own. CIA analysts, embassy staff, and members of the U.S. Information Service treated him as an indispensable interpreter of Vietnamese reality. They told him what they thought, what they feared, and what they planned, never suspecting that each conversation was being translated into invisible ink for another master. An's brilliance lay not in theft, but in synthesis. He gathered fragments, a map from one source, a rumor from another, a misplaced memo from a third, and assembled them into coherent intelligence. He did not pass raw data. He sent finished analysis, polished as if for an editor's approval. His handlers later said his reports read like strategic briefings, complete with political forecasts and military assessments. He often drew maps by hand, annotating them with the precision of a journalist obsessed with accuracy. Then, he would hide the pages in the hollow leg of a chair or beneath the false bottom of a basket until they could be smuggled north through a network of couriers. He worked mostly from the city's cafes, Givral, Brodard, La Pagode, where correspondents gathered to trade rumors and drink coffee. There, in the haze of cigarette smoke and the chatter of typewriters, An performed his quiet magic. He asked questions without seeming to ask them. He listened more than he spoke. He played the part of the ever-curious local, amused by the foreigner's bewilderment. No one suspected that the notes he jotted during lunch breaks would later shape Hanoi's understanding of enemy strategy. As the war escalated, so did On's influence. Through his friendships with high-ranking South Vietnamese officials and American officers, he gained access to documents most spies would have risked their lives to steal. When he warned that the United States was preparing a major operation in the Central Highlands, Hanoi adjusted its troop movements. When he reported internal rifts within Saigon's leadership, his analyses helped the North time their offensives. Yet for all his success, An remained torn between affection and duty. He genuinely liked many of the Americans he deceived. He shared meals with them, visited their homes, and even helped some of them escape during the chaotic final days of April 1975. Years later, those who survived recalled him not with hatred, but with disbelief. That the man who had translated their hopes into copy was, all along, their enemy's most valuable intelligence officer. The CIA, for its part, came to regard the Un affair as a haunting lesson in the limits of counterintelligence. Saigon Station, long confident in its ability to map the networks of infiltration, realized too late that its most devastating breach had come not from the shadows, but from the light, from within the open, sociable world of journalism. The enemy had not broken through a door, he had been invited in for coffee. When the truth emerged after the fall of Saigon, Western correspondents who had known Un struggled to reconcile the man with the revelation. Some refused to believe it. Others, like his former colleagues at Time, described him with a strange respect. "He never lied to me," one said. "He just didn't tell me everything." The paradox of Phạm Xuân Ẩn was not his deceit, it was his humanity. Unlike the caricature of a fanatic agent, he was a man of deep empathy and intellect. He adored Western literature, jazz, and journalism. He spoke lovingly of his friends in the US Embassy and mourned the chaos that followed the war's end. In interviews after reunification, he insisted that he had fought not against people, but against policies, that his allegiance to Vietnam's independence outweighed every personal tie. His story became a fascination for scholars, journalists, and novelists alike. Books such as Perfect Spy sought to unravel the layers of his life, while academic seminars at Fulbright University, Vietnam, dissected his methods as a case study in human intelligence. They found in him the ultimate paradox, a man who embodied the very duality that defined the war itself, a conflict where truth and deception were indistinguishable and where the line between enemy and ally blurred into tragedy. From a counterintelligence perspective, Un's success was almost supernatural. He maintained his cover through the most paranoid years of the conflict, when Saigon was saturated with surveillance and loyalty checks. He survived purges, coups, and shifting regimes. He even continued to provide analysis to the Americans after the Tet Offensive, when the city was crawling with suspicion. Each time someone questioned him, his charm and impeccable credentials disarmed them. To the CIA, his existence was a kind of dark miracle, a reminder that even in a world built on suspicion, belief could still be exploited. The irony deepened in the final days of the war. As North Vietnamese tanks advanced on Saigon in April 1975, Un quietly helped arrange the evacuation of several friends who were on American evacuation lists. Men who, had they known his true identity, might have arrested him. He risked exposure not to protect himself, but to spare those who had trusted him. When the city fell, he stayed behind. He had no need to flee. His mission was complete. After the war, Phạm Xuân Ẩn lived quietly in a modest house in what had become Ho Chi Minh City. He received honors from the government he had served and occasional visits from the journalists he had once guided. They drank tea together, reminiscing about the old days, as if the years of deception were simply another story to file before deadline. In his later interviews, Un spoke with a philosopher's detachment. "I had two lives," he said, "and I balanced them both. But in the end, I am still one person." It was a statement as haunting as it was true. For the Americans, he was a painful reminder that the most dangerous enemy was the one who understood them completely. For the Vietnamese, he was proof that patience, intellect, and subtlety could defeat even the mightiest empire. The legacy of Phạm Xuân Ẩn endures as more than a tale of espionage. It is the mirror of the war itself, brilliant, deceptive, and tragic. His life forced historians and intelligence officers alike to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the boundaries between truth and treachery are not drawn by nations, but by necessity. In the heart of Saigon, where agents plotted and generals schemed, one man had listened, smiled, and taken everything. And he did it not from the shadows, but in the full light of day. Inside the gray corridors of Langley, far from the red dust of Vietnam, the war was fought in words, numbers, and interpretation. Intelligence reports stacked higher than sandbags. Memos carried the weight of life and death, and every forecast was a wager against uncertainty. To those in Washington, the war appeared as a series of cables and graphs. To those in Saigon, it was blood and breath. Between the two stood the Central Intelligence Agency, both analyst and witness, often ignored by the very policymakers it served. By the early 1960s, the CIA had begun compiling what would later be known as the Vietnam Policymakers Files, a vast series of analyses detailing the political, military, and psychological dimensions of the conflict. These reports, revisited decades later in the Ford collection, revealed a striking paradox. The agency's assessments were often accurate, yet seldom heeded. Analysts at Langley had warned that South Vietnam's political foundations were brittle, that communist resolve was underestimated, and that attrition warfare could not measure progress in a war fought through ideology and endurance. But in the fever of policy, truth was often trimmed to fit the rhetoric of optimism. Intelligence was supposed to illuminate decision-making. Instead, it became its shadow. The culture of Washington rewarded certainty, not caution. Presidents wanted metrics, not nuance. Generals wanted victory curves, not moral equations. The CIA's analysts, bound by the discipline of evidence, could only offer probabilities. Their restraint was read as pessimism. Then came Tet, and with it, vindication wrapped in catastrophe. In the early hours of January 31st, 1968, communist forces launched a nationwide offensive that shattered the illusion of control. For years, intelligence estimates had suggested that the Viet Cong were rebuilding capacity, even as official figures declared them crippled. Now, from the highlands to the capital, that resilience exploded into view. The embassy in Saigon was breached. Provincial capitals fell under siege. The shock in Washington was not only at the scale of the attack, but at its existence. How, the policymakers asked, could this have happened without warning? The truth was that the warnings had come. They had simply been muffled by disbelief. Field officers had detected increased movements along the borders, spikes in communications, and reports of political agitation in the cities. Yet within the bureaucratic maze, these fragments never cohered into urgency. Some saw the threat, others dismissed it as seasonal activity. When Tet erupted, the divide between the intelligence community and the military command widened into a gulf. In the chaotic months that followed, Langley and the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, entered a quiet war of interpretation. Mei Phi's leadership insisted that the Tet Offensive was a tactical defeat for the communists, that their losses in men and materiel proved the effectiveness of U.S. firepower. The CIA, however, saw something deeper and more troubling. It argued that while the Viet Cong had suffered militarily, they had won psychologically and politically. They had demonstrated to the South Vietnamese population and to the American public that no city was safe, no government unshakable. The debate over the VCI, the Viet Cong infrastructure, became the axis of disagreement. MACV's body counts painted progress. CIA field reports revealed regeneration. By mid-1969, analysts at Saigon Station noted that the enemy's political networks were rebuilding faster than anticipated, often under new aliases and local fronts. The infrastructure, like a vine, grew back from its roots each time it was cut. Phoenix operations, though brutal and widespread, had pruned branches without killing the trunk. The arguments grew sharper in the early 1970s, when the agency attempted to forecast the scale and intent of the Easter Offensive of 1972. Satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and prisoner interrogations all pointed to increased troop movements along the demilitarized zone. Analysts warned that a large-scale attack was imminent, perhaps in coordination with political offensives designed to test American resolve during the peace talks in Paris. Yet policy inertia and wishful thinking dulled the warnings. The result was a familiar tragedy. When the offensive came in March, it caught both Saigon and Washington unprepared. The lesson that emerged, one repeated like a mantra in intelligence circles, was the failure to measure will. The agency could count divisions, estimate tonnage, and track convoys, but it could not quantify determination. The enemy's will to fight, fueled by nationalism and unity of purpose, lay beyond the reach of graphs and estimates. We could measure everything, one retired analyst later said, except the one thing that mattered. Within Langley, the post-Tet years became a crucible of introspection. Analysts dissected their own methods, debating whether intelligence had been too cautious or too constrained by policy expectations. Some argued that the CIA should have been louder, even insubordinate in pushing its conclusions. Others warned that overstepping would have rendered the agency political, a fate just as fatal to credibility. The tension between truth and influence remained unresolved, and in that ambiguity, the war continued. Meanwhile, in Saigon, the Accords apparatus persisted with its blend of civil and military governance. The CIA's role evolved from direct operations to advisory oversight, emphasizing what they called infrastructure targeting rather than body counts. The idea was to replace blunt attrition with a deeper form of stabilization, winning allegiance in the villages through security, education, and selective intelligence work. It was, in theory, a moral correction to the Phoenix excesses. In practice, it was another layer of bureaucracy piled atop exhaustion. Still, within this slow machinery, a few lessons solidified. The agency realized that wars of insurgency were as much about governance as about guns. Political legitimacy, not military strength, determined endurance. A village secured by force could be lost overnight through corruption or neglect. Hearts and minds had become a slogan, but it remained the unlearned principle of the conflict. Back in Washington, however, the institutional distance between Langley, the White House, and Saigon turned insight into impotence. Reports that contradicted official optimism were softened in transmission. Analytical cautions were reworded to avoid political discomfort. By the time information reached policymakers, it was often stripped of its urgency, transformed from warning into footnote. The bureaucracy had become a filter through which clarity turned to fog. By the early 1970s, the CIA's internal mood was one of weary accuracy. The analysts had been right too often, too late. They had predicted the brittleness of Diem's regime before its collapse, the futility of rural pacification before Phoenix imploded, and the likelihood of large-scale offensives before each arrived. Yet prediction without policy was prophecy without power. When the agency compiled its retrospective series, later published as the CIA and the Vietnam Policymakers, it read like a chronicle of missed connections. Time and again, intelligence had presented reality. Time and again, decision-makers had chosen illusion. The documents revealed a quiet tragedy, not the failure to know, but the failure to listen. In the closing paragraphs of one 1972 assessment, a weary analyst wrote, "The war in Vietnam has taught us that truth, no matter how precise, must compete with politics, and politics does not need to be right to endure." It was not an accusation, merely an observation, the kind that only comes from watching patterns repeat until they lose meaning. By then, the debates at Langley had lost their urgency. The war's fate was already sealed in the corridors of diplomacy, and the analysts who had argued over data now turned to documenting its lessons. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the history of Vietnam would not be written in victories or defeats, but in the distance between knowledge and action. The Tet Offensive had revealed that gap in blood and fire. The years after it proved that the gap could not be closed, not by more data, not by better predictions, not even by sincerity. Between 1962 and 1972, the CIA learned what every empire learns too late, that understanding the truth of a war does not mean controlling it. Knowledge may pierce the fog, but it cannot command the wind. By the time Thomas Polgar arrived in Saigon in January 1972, the war had already entered its final act. The air still hummed with the sound of helicopters, but the rhythm had changed. It was slower, more deliberate, the rhythm of withdrawal. The American presence was shrinking. The embassies were fortresses preparing to be abandoned. Polgar, a Hungarian-born veteran of the intelligence world, carried not the bravado of conquest, but the quiet discipline of survival. His task was twofold: to keep the CIA's networks alive amid the crumbling facade of South Vietnam, and to navigate the thin line between diplomacy and despair. He was an unlikely figure for such an ending. Educated, dryly humorous, fluent in several languages, Polgar was less a spy than a statesman of the invisible. When he assumed control of Saigon Station, the Paris peace accords were nearing conclusion, promising a ceasefire that everyone knew would not hold. The Americans were preparing to exit, and yet their intelligence footprint, years in the making, could not simply vanish. Polgar was sent to manage the retreat without surrendering the dignity of the mission. Under his direction, the station shifted from offensive operations to risk management. The focus moved from subversion to preservation, from winning to leaving without humiliation. He worked closely with both the American Embassy and the newly reorganized South Vietnamese Intelligence Service, ensuring that agents, documents, and informants were not left to the mercy of events. His role demanded the tact of a diplomat and the resolve of a soldier. Each day brought new instructions from Washington. Each night, new rumors from the streets. After the signing of the Paris Agreement in January 1973, the illusion of peace briefly settled over Saigon. U.S. troops withdrew, leaving behind advisors, airmen, and the massive bureaucracy of cords in the embassy compound. But the war never truly ended. The ceasefire became a pause filled with deception, each side rearming, repositioning, and pretending to believe in the words they signed. For Polgar, the city became both a theater and a trap. He kept his network running. Old agents embedded in ministries, double contacts among officers, and quiet sympathizers who supplied the last reliable intelligence from the countryside. He also became, in effect, a political counselor, maintaining secret lines of communication with figures in both the South Vietnamese government and the diplomatic corps. He could sense that the end would come not as an explosion, but as a slow implosion, the steady erosion of will, trust, and time. By 1975, the erosion had become a collapse. Northern troops advanced faster than any forecast had dared to predict. One province after another fell, not through battle, but through surrender. Refugees poured into Saigon by the hundreds of thousands, carrying only rumors and fear. Polgar understood that his final duty was no longer to collect intelligence, but to protect people. The agents, informants, and friends who would be marked for death once the communists arrived. He began organizing quiet evacuations. Using diplomatic channels, coded messages, and borrowed military flights, he helped move out journalists, technicians, and sensitive Vietnamese contacts. One of the most delicate operations involved arranging the departure of President Nguyen Van Thieu himself. On April 25, 1975, under pressure from both Washington and his own generals, Thieu boarded a U.S. aircraft for Taiwan. Polgar ensured that the transfer happened discreetly, avoiding the chaos of public exposure. The act was not a coup, merely the last stage of disintegration. In those final days, Saigon resembled a city under hypnosis. The streets were crowded but silent, as if the population was waiting for something unspeakable. The embassy compound became a citadel. Marines stacked ammunition boxes in corridors. Helicopters idled on rooftops, their rotors slicing the humid air. Inside, Polgar and Ambassador Graham Martin worked around the clock, drafting contingency plans with code names that tried to disguise their desperation. The most famous of these was Operation Frequent Wind, the last evacuation plan for Saigon. The signal to begin it would be broadcast on Armed Forces radio as a song, White Christmas. It was absurd, poetic, and cruel, a farewell disguised as nostalgia. For those in the know, hearing Bing Crosby's voice would mean it was time to move. Alongside that signal, a secret phrase circulated among CIA and Marine personnel. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising. When that sentence went out, the final extraction would begin. On April 29th, the phrase was spoken. Helicopters began their relentless dance between the embassy roof and the waiting ships of the 7th Fleet in the South China Sea. Every 10 minutes, another chopper rose with evacuees. Vietnamese officials, American civilians, children, and those lucky enough to be on the list. The air shook with rotor wash and panic. At the edges of the compound, desperate crowds pressed against the walls, shouting for help. Polgar moved through the chaos with calm precision, directing his team to prioritize intelligence staff and vulnerable sources. Meanwhile, artillery shells began falling on Tan Son Nhut Airport, the main evacuation route by fixed-wing aircraft. The runways cratered, the sky burned. From that moment on, the only way out was vertical. The city below became a storm of motion. Fires, rumors, broken radios, and the endless thrum of helicopter blades. Through the night, the station operated as a command post and sanctuary. Polgar's staff shredded files, destroyed codebooks, and burned years of reports that could compromise Vietnamese agents left behind. The smell of smoke filled the offices where once, years earlier, strategies for victory had been drafted. What remained were fragments, names written in invisible ink that history would never read. At dawn on April 30th, as the last helicopters lifted off from the embassy roof, Polgar composed his final cable. It was addressed simply to Washington, but its tone belonged to no bureaucracy. It read less like a report than a eulogy. "This will be the final message from Saigon Station," it began. He described the situation with the precision of a witness and the restraint of a man determined not to sentimentalize the end. Yet within the formal language, a quiet sorrow bled through. He wrote that the political and military structures of South Vietnam had ceased to exist, that the evacuation was nearly complete, and that his team was shutting down communications. Then he added a sentence that would echo through the annals of intelligence history. "This will be the final chapter of a long and honorable effort." Minutes later, the cable was sent, the last heartbeat of an empire's hidden arm. Not long after, Polgar and the remaining staff boarded one of the final helicopters. From above, they could see the city shrinking beneath them. The river curling through smoke, the boulevards choked with vehicles, the palace gleaming in the morning sun. Saigon, the city of 1,000 intrigues, was ending not in a gunfight, but in a silent surrender. When they reached the fleet, the sailors helped them aboard with quiet respect. The decks were crowded with refugees, Marines, and evacuees staring back at the horizon. The sea smelled of fuel and salt. Polgar stood on the deck, watching the last plumes of smoke rise from the coast. He said nothing. Perhaps he knew that the war had not ended. It had merely changed form, shifting from the jungles of Vietnam to the memories of those who had survived it. Later, his final cable would be studied in academies and memoirs, not as intelligence but as literature. A rare moment when the machinery of espionage spoke with a human voice. It was both farewell and confession, a recognition that for all the years of strategy and secrecy, the outcome had always been beyond their control. On April 30th, 1975, Saigon fell. The radio went silent. The signal was gone. The last station had signed off. And in that silence, the long shadow of the war stretched from the burning city to the quiet halls of Langley, where men like Thomas Polgar would forever wonder if they had been witnesses or participants in history's most elaborate illusion. When the dust of April 30th settled, Saigon no longer existed, at least not in the way the world had known it. The city that once pulsed with intrigue, fear, and ambition was now quiet, its streets echoing with the clatter of departing boots and the distant roar of tanks. For the men and women of Saigon Station, it was the end of an era, but not the end of the story. The files they left behind, the methods they perfected, and the moral wounds they carried would ripple far beyond the war they lost. The curtain had fallen, but the shadows remained. The most enduring of those shadows came from the PRU and the Phoenix program, those twin instruments of counterinsurgency that had defined the middle years of the war. To some within the intelligence world, they represented a model of efficiency, localized, precise, and adaptive. To others, they stood as a stain on America's conscience. The provincial reconnaissance units, born from the idea of surgical strikes against the Viet Cong infrastructure, had achieved what traditional armies could not: the ability to strike deep into the political heart of the insurgency. Villages once considered sanctuaries for guerrillas became battlegrounds of information and fear. Files replaced trenches, interrogations replaced firefights. But effectiveness came at a cost. The very metrics that defined success, those endless reports of neutralized cadres, turned morality into arithmetic. In the bureaucratic vocabulary of Saigon Station, a life could be reduced to a line on a form: killed, captured, or converted. The program's defenders insisted that such precision saved lives in the long run, that the alternative was chaos and defeat. Its critics saw only the erosion of principle, the quiet normalization of brutality. The truth, as always, lay between the numbers, a truth that still refuses to settle. Historians later called Phoenix both a lesson and a warning, a demonstration that intelligence can win battles but lose legitimacy, that victory measured in body counts cannot measure peace. It remains a case study in the eternal paradox of counterinsurgency, the belief that fear can create stability and that control can replace consent. The broken operations of Project Tiger and Sao-Ji told a different but equally haunting story. They revealed the limits of infiltration, the fragility of trust, and the impossible geometry of a war fought in mirrors. Every parachute drop into the north, every boat launched into hostile waters, ended with the same cruel mathematics: capture, conversion, or silence. the North Vietnamese had mastered the art of counterintelligence. They turned the Americans' ambition into their own weapon. The failures of those missions became quiet warnings, carved into the agency's institutional memory. Years later, analysts would look back on those operations not as blunders of courage, but as errors of assumption. The belief that superior technology and daring could outwit a society bound by ideology and patience. Vietnam had shown that secrecy was not the same as invisibility, and that in a nation where every village had eyes, no mission could truly vanish. Then there was the paradox embodied by Phạm Xuân Ẩn, the man who had walked undetected through the corridors of both truth and deception. To intelligence professionals, his story became an enduring lesson in humility. He was the perfect case study in source verification, the reminder that familiarity breeds blindness. Saigon Station had built layers of surveillance around ministries, armies, and networks, yet had failed to see the enemy sitting beside them, sipping coffee and editing copy for Time magazine. In later CIA training seminars, his name surfaced not as condemnation, but as revelation. The agency learned too late that information is only as reliable as the assumptions behind it, and that friendship, so valuable in human intelligence, can also be the most dangerous disguise. On's story remains the ultimate riddle of the Vietnam War. A man who loved the very people he deceived, and whose greatest success was to remain undiscovered until his war was long won. Beyond individuals and operations, Vietnam left behind a deeper legacy, the war between analysis and policy. The CIA's own retrospectives, such as the Vietnam Policymakers volumes and the Declassified files, revealed the aching pattern. Analysts had seen much, understood much, and warned much, but their insights rarely reached those in power unchanged. Information filtered upward through layers of optimism and fear until it arrived polished, simplified, and neutered. What Langley had written in caution, Washington read as confidence. That institutional fracture, the gap between what was known and what was acted upon, outlived the war itself. It haunted future interventions, shaping doctrines in Central America, the Middle East, and beyond. Each new crisis brought the whispered refrain, "We saw it coming, we just didn't say it loud enough." The Vietnam files became not just records of a lost war, but mirrors reflecting the human tendency to ignore what does not fit the desired story. For many of the veterans of Saigon Station, the fall of April 1975 became a personal reckoning. Some retired in silence. Others wrote memoirs searching for meaning amid the ruins. A few returned to Asia years later, walking through cities reborn under new flags, their memories intact, but their loyalties uncertain. They spoke of friends left behind, of names erased from lists, of moments when duty blurred into regret. From the roof of the embassy that last morning, one could see the antennas trembling under the wind from the helicopters, the smoke curling upward from the burning files, and the endless line of evacuees waiting for their turn to leave. The song on the radio, White Christmas, had long finished, but its echo lingered, absurdly gentle against the chaos below. In that strange mixture of irony and grief lay the entire story of America in Vietnam. A war fought with conviction, ending with confusion, a mission of liberation collapsing into evacuation. Among the last transmissions from Saigon was Polgar's message to Washington, a final plea disguised as closure. It ended not with bitterness, but with weary clarity. Let us not repeat history. It was both prayer and warning. Yet history, like the phoenix itself, tends to rise from its own ashes. The lessons of Saigon Station were studied, debated, and too often repeated in new forms, under different names, in different lands. The obsession with intelligence metrics, the faith in precision over perception, the belief that information alone could reshape societies, all would reappear in later decades, proving that some ghosts never truly rest. Still, within that shadowed legacy lies a quieter truth. For all its failures, Saigon Station was also a testament to human endurance. The analysts who wrote their reports knowing no one would read them. The field officers who risked their lives for fragments of truth. The Vietnamese agents who believed that information might one day buy freedom. They operated in a world without applause, where success was invisible and failure eternal. The war ended, but the people did not vanish. Some of those who once served the station built new lives in exile. Others, trapped by fate, adapted to the new order. A few found solace in remembering that even in the darkest corridors of espionage, there had been loyalty, friendship, and fleeting moments of compassion. In the end, Saigon Station's legacy is not merely about intelligence or failure. It is about understanding. It is about the cost of seeing too much and the pain of being ignored. It is about the moral gravity that lingers when knowledge outlives action. And above all, it is about the enduring truth that in war, as in life, no one ever knows the whole story. From the tower that once held its antennas, the city below has changed. The noise of war has faded into the hum of traffic, the smell of smoke replaced by the scent of rain. But if one listens closely, perhaps in the stillness before dawn, one can almost hear the echo of the final transmission, the last breath of an empire's secret voice whispering into the ether. Saigon Station, signing off.